Alrighty. Well, this is our first Coffee Breaks with Nebraska Strong Recovery project from home. So that's exciting. I would like to introduce Alex. Alex works with Grief's Journey, who has very graciously offered to join me today. We had planned to have Alex on the podcast a while ago because grief and disaster kind of go like that. And then we had all this COVID stuff start up. So we got creative and thought we would give, Zoom YouTube a go. So Alex, thanks so much for joining me remotely and just taking some time out of your day.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. So, hi, everybody. I'm Alex Jurgens. I am the Senior Outreach and Inclusion Coordinator at Grief's Journey. I've been with the agency for over a year now, started February of 2019. And I was brought to Grief's Journey specifically just due to significant losses in my life, focusing on the bereavement side of grief. And I think generally that's how most people think about grief, is that you only grieve due to a death. And that was my assumption for a few years as well. It was up until a couple years ago that I recognized, grief is way more complex than what we think of it. It comes in many different forms. It comes from many different circumstances. I really like this definition of grief. It says grief is, it comes from the physical, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual response to an actual threat and loss of a person, place, or thing to which we are emotionally attached. So basically, grief is, what is our internal reaction? How do we respond ourselves individually to a grief experience? And when you hear that definition, it's recognizing the actual or threatened loss of a person, place, or thing. So that really just shows that grief is very complex. It's something that happens from many different losses that we may experience in our lives. And we think about COVID-19 and this global pandemic that we're in. This is a significant form of grief that we're in right now. And for me, when I think about grief, it really is that loss of normalcy as well. Those things you're used to doing. Those things that you had this schedule of this routine as well. You think for a young person, they're so used to, okay, I'm going to go to school until this point, and now they're not. Now they have to be at home. And then it kind of just creates a lot of the stress and anxiety and a lot of questions of the unknown as well. And that is a form of grief called ambiguous grief, which is really, it comes from a loss of without closure or understanding. And so that's kind of what we're experiencing right now. When we think about also with the flood as well, that's a form of grief where we see the disenfranchised, the ambiguous grief. A lot of what if questions are coming up. A lot of, trying to make sense of that reality, trying to find answers. And not necessarily knowing the duration and outcome of what's going on. We can have an idea, we can have projections, but we don't necessarily know what that's going to look like moving forward. And that creates a lot of fear, that creates a lot of anxiety, that creates a lot of stress as well.
Yeah.
And again, generally, we have those grief reactions that come up individually, and that makes us feel like we're alone, and that's really hard.
Yeah. I really like that in your definition, and just kind of with everything you were saying, the loss or the threat of loss. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's not even that we've actually seen some of these things come to fruition, but it's the, oh my gosh, but what if, like you were saying, those what ifs can be really painful.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's a big thing to emphasize too, I think when we think about, when the flood was happening last year as well, that transpired into a lot of what if questions. Mm-hmm. And then as we were getting into this new year after winter, it was like, okay, what if the flood happens again? What if this, whether there's more damage, what if this does happen? And then suddenly we also now are in this pandemic that sort of came out gradually and then became really big, especially here in the United States. Mm-hmm. And we know this is happening globally, but it just kind of came out of this place where we're like, I didn't have time to really make sense of experience
Right.
as well. And we're all trying to do that right now. For us, like we naturally try to want to make sense of our circumstances. We want to find those answers because as humans, we have a hard time with change. And but when a circumstance is really hard and it's really challenging and it creates a lot of that stress as well, we're constantly searching with not necessarily having that answer. And that's really, really hard and difficult to experience.
Right. Well, and there's also the fact that I think with disasters in general, normally you kind of have that adrenaline wave, right?
Mhm.
So getting through the initial, and then it's kind of after everybody leaves the funeral, after
Mhm.
a lot of cleanup has started to happen, things
Mhm.
like that, then you kind of have oh man,
Mhm.
now
Yeah.
I'm alone. Now,
Mhm.
the pieces kind of start to click together. I think the interesting thing with some of this COVID stuff is we're kind of getting to the end of that adrenaline wave,
Mhm.
but we're not at the end of kind of the shocking part of this because we're still, working remotely and all of that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very valid point because when we think about grief, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that there's no timeline.
Hmm.
So we can't sit here and just say, well, this is your timeline. This is how you grieve. You just do these steps and then you're done.
Here are your
Everybody
five
grieves differently.
steps.
What was that?
I said, here are your 5 steps.
Yeah, exactly. And that does, and you and I have talked about this, Lisa, before, is that creates this idea that grief is linear, but it's really
Hmm.
not linear. It's very individualized. Even within your own family unit, it's different. You're gonna have different reactions.
Yeah.
So it's being mindful that your reactions are going to be different than your peers, your loved ones. Also, it's not like you consistently grieve the same way.
Hmm.
So it's being mindful that there is no timeline to grief. It's really based on your experience and it's for you and you have to recognize for yourself what are you doing to take care of yourself. That's very true. And it's really like we always say when I do these presentations for the public, I always say like grief really is a marathon, it's not a sprint as well. And a lot of times too, you don't feel those reactions until a little while after your loss experience. It's still kind of that shock that those feelings like, okay, I'm trying to make sense of what's going on, and then that after part is where it kind of those grief reactions really do heighten as well.
Yeah.
So it's be mindful that even if you think like, oh, I had some closure, some understanding, those feelings are still going to exist. Those, and you're still going to have, those behavioral, those thought patterns that do come up also.
Yeah. So two things that we've talked about before that I think would just be really beneficial to touch on before we kind of wrap up today
Mhm.
is you have talked about grief bursts before and then
Yes.
also secondary losses or secondary grief. Can you touch on those two things?
Yes. Grief burst, first of all, for me, this is so profound when I first heard about them because I'm like, when they happened to me, I thought I was the only one that ever had this experience. And
Right.
now knowing
Ditto.
everybody experiences them. So, grief burst is, I'm going to paint this little picture. So, imagine you go to the grocery store and, you're in there, you're getting the supplies that you need, whatever that looks like. And then let's say suddenly you hear a song or you smell something or you see something that reminds you of a loss that you had in your life. So when we think about this, for example, it could be maybe you see, hear, or smell something that reminds you of a person that has died in your life. And suddenly you're kind of taken back by it feels like it's day one of that loss. And
Mhm.
suddenly you just get really emotional, you get really upset. It kind of comes out of nowhere in a way. That's what we call grief burst. This is something that happens to everybody. But when it happens, though, we tend to just think it's only me. Like I'm the only one that has this experience. So we're seeing this also with, COVID-19. We're also have seen this with the flood too. It's those reminders of things that, you don't have anymore. Those, whether it's people or things or places you're not able to go as well. You could see them, whether you're on social media, you're talking to somebody on the phone, you're having these interactions, and suddenly you're reminded of, oh, yeah, that's right, I don't have this anymore. And that's really hard. And it kind of takes you back to day one, which is something that's really difficult, but it's that understanding that when this does happen, this is common. This is very common in grief. And then asking yourself, what do you need to do to take care of yourself at that time? What do you need to do to get yourself in a space where you're focusing on your well-being? So that's a great first.
Yeah.
And then to your second question, what is secondary loss? So secondary loss is thinking about what are those other losses that you have lost from your primary loss as well. So thinking about, when we think about the global pandemic, for example, a secondary loss would be, if you wanted to go on a field, like a first student, if they're going on a field trip, for example. Just kind of came in the top of my head for some reason. But they're not able to go on that field trip, and they get really upset. And they're like, well, I really want to go to this. I wanted to do this thing with my peers, with my classmates. And then it digs deeper into really their primary loss is that they don't get to be around, their classmates, their teacher. They don't get to do this fun thing. And it's that reminder also that they're not in school right now. They're not able to have those end of the year celebrations. They're not able to do those fun things that happen in spring, that we were used to doing when we were kids.
Yeah.
So that's an example of what a secondary loss would be. Like, what are like those other losses that we lose due to that primary loss as well? So it's really thinking that sometimes we can hear somebody say, like, they get so fixated on something that to us we might say, okay, I don't know why, they're feeling this. It doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. It's not like, why are they really getting upset about this?
Right. It was a piece of furniture or something like that. But then you learned that it was great grandma's, rocking chair that all the grandbabies got rocked to sleep in or something like that. And you're losing a reminder.
Because keep in mind, like those sentimental values, so for some people, that's going to be very important to them. And it might not make sense to you, and that's okay as well. Because keep in mind, for you, there are things that are sentimental to you that imagine if you lost them. Imagine if they were no longer there. And that would be really hard because it reminds you of that primary loss. Right. Like there's a reason why there's an attachment to it that's like, no, it's deeper than just that piece of furniture or, this thing in my kitchen. It reminds me of this person every time I see it or I hold it, whatever that is.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Alex, thank you so much for just taking a giant topic and giving us some information on it in such a short amount of time. I really just appreciate your time and just all the things that you're doing to help support and just be a resource and educating us more about grief.
Yeah, well, thank you for everything that you're doing as well. So, grateful to have done this together, to have worked together to do this presentation. So thank you so much for asking us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us, everyone out in the nether sphere and YouTube spaces. I'm going to stop now while I'm behind. So thank you for joining us for Coffee Breaks with Nebraska Strong Recovery Project, and we will see you next time.
Bye, everyone.